So just a couple of other points I'd wanted to make, and I didn't want to keep the commissioner waiting. Adopting new technology is really one of the core subjects that the Regulatory Study Center has been looking at. And it's adopting new technology is one thing, but adopting it in a regulatory framework is something else. And as we have seen over the years, regulating AI for private actor use or regulating technology for private actor use is one thing, but for doing the business of government, it is something different. And so that's a kind of a unique problem and a unique challenge, and one that, we've seen over the years technology be adopted more slowly by the government, because when the government is being, having coercive power against people, it has to take its actions more slowly and more deliberatively, and that's really the function, the subject of what we're here to talk about today. I will also say that in my experience, when you've been around, when you get to be old, you get to talk about what you saw back in the day, and when I was back at DOT. In the last 25 years, we've seen a lot of promises of technology, and rolling it out in terms of what technological promise is and then being done in a way that the regulatory oversight can be comfortable with are often different things. So, for example, we heard in the last decade, this decade, we heard a lot about AI. Last decade, we heard a lot about autonomy. And, autonomous vehicles are just now beginning to be rolled out on a very limited basis. They still can't go in the snow. And so trying to bring technology on board in a way that satisfies regulatory concerns is another challenging and difficult and a subject that I'm glad we're going to talk a lot about today. And then the final thing I will say is I sometimes look at, when it comes to technology adoption, use a very simplistic example of aviation. So basically every commercial airliner anybody has ever gotten on, and including business jets in the last 30 years, is completely capable of taking off, flying, and landing on its own, and doing so even more safely than human pilots. And I would say, how many planes have people gotten on without human pilots? And that would be zero. And that's because human factors become important. And so as the government looks at adopting AI, what is the role of the humanity and humans in doing it? And again, I think we'll hear a lot about that today. So for our in-person keynote, I want to introduce somebody who's very, an integral part of the Regulatory Study Center and one of our most distinguished alums. Professor Bridget Dooling is now an assistant professor at Ohio State University. She's still a research professor at the Regulatory Study Center. She'd been a deputy branch chief at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. She's a voting member of the Administrative Conference. She's one of the heads of the ABA Administrative Law Conference, and truly one of the national experts on administrative law. And we're really, really fortunate that she came here today to give us some of her thoughts. So she's going to come up and speak to you all for a few minutes, and then we're going to do questions through technology. So we're going to try, except we're going to have a human interface, me, to be reading the questions. So we're not relying on AI to do that. And interpret them. So if you want to ask a question, just scan the barcode or scan the code and send a question, and we will read it. And with that, Professor Bridget Dooling. Thanks.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Reg Studies is my home away from home. It will always be. I spent 5 years there as a research professor, and now I'm in real America. I'm in Ohio, where I'm a law professor. And over the years, I've written a bunch about technology and regulation. Before I came to academia, I spent over 10 years as a civil servant in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. So I come to almost every research question that I consider with that government perspective. I just can't do anything about it. It's just part of who I am. I think like a bureaucrat, and I'm learning to think like a scholar. It's going to be a life's work. But that's sort of how I approach questions. Also, I should say, I won't be offended if anybody gets up to get a refill of a beverage or more roast potatoes. Please help yourself. Please make yourselves comfortable. This is meant to be a good time. Okay, so as I say, I'm a longtime civil servant turned academic law professor. And that perspective leads me, like both elements of that end up showing up in my work. All right, and so here we are at an AI conference. So we're going to hear the phrase humans in the loop approximately 6,500 times. We've already got a couple on the board from the great Commissioner Johnson. There's something about that term that's always bothered me, something I just don't like. It sticks in my craw. And so I'm going to use this as a live therapy session for me to work through what bothers me about this phrase, human in the loop. Human in the loop. What's the problem? Okay, there's something subordinating about it, right? It puts us on the level of a colleague of the tech. We're just a peer. We're checking the work. We're a quality control inspector on the line, seeing if the widgets that came off production, comply with our quality metrics, right? This to me is an impoverished sense of the majesty of human judgment. Okay, let me take a step back. I'm no Luddite, right? I may not have the most up-to-date iPhone. I may not have been an early adopter of the iPhone. I had a flip phone for longer than I probably should have, but I'm not making my point very well. My point is that I get there, right? And I've written a ton about a positive vision for the role of technology in the regulatory system. So if you don't know much about me, you might be thinking, oh boy, here we go. We're going to be hearing about the bad parts of AI. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about the good parts of AI in the regulatory system, and I'm going to dwell a little bit on something that I think just doesn't get enough airtime. There are truly so many things that an algorithm can do better than me. I mean, it's almost endless, right? It can do all kinds of things in a superior fashion to the way that I can do them. Best route to the airport? I'm not going to have your best option. I'm not going to be able to integrate real-time traffic updates into your route. I'm not going to be able to anticipate all kinds of things about what we might need. Restaurant recommendations for a new city, if I haven't been there, I just won't have any for you. But our algorithms, they've got you, right? So there are going to be things where algorithms just beat me every time. I'm sure it could beat me in a chess match. And I don't quibble at all with the idea of using big data to get a new perspective on old problems. Problems like, fraud, locating fraud, optimizing supply chains, and so on. In these domains, the idea of a human in the loop embraces the comparative advantage of algorithms to solve problems. And that is good. That is unequivocally good. Jobs may be lost, yes, but I tend to think that we'll shift those jobs to other more enriching work, right? So I'm not somebody who thinks get the algorithms out of society. But of course, we're not just at an AI conference. We're here at the intersection of AI and regulation. So let's talk use cases. I was joking with my table mates that we should have a AI bingo card. Use cases would absolutely be a square at an AI conference, right? So that's another square on your bingo card. So let's talk through a few. Okay, we've heard about a couple already. A couple are already on the board. The idea of using AI to assist with regulatory compliance. I think this is a no-brainer, and not just because of who our sponsor is. I think it's a very good idea. AI may simply be able to see things that we can't in data, patterns, trends, relationships between data that we just can't perceive. And here the idea of a human in the loop makes sense, right? And there it exists to almost counter the idea of the human out of the loop, another concept in AI, which basically says if a human's out of the loop, which is a phrase we hear a little bit less, the idea is that the decision-making happens by the algorithm and the human is not involved, right? Human in the loop is the opposite of that, where the algorithm does, a fair bit of the analytical work to offer up an option. The human jumps in and has to actually authorize things. So human in the loop, human out of the loop, it's just what's the default? Does the algorithm go ahead and execute, or does the human have to say, wait for me, I'm going to choose, right? So that's human in the loop, human out of the loop. And so that dichotomy between human out of the loop and human in the loop makes a lot of sense when it comes to something like compliance assistance, right? If an algorithm simply says, we think that there might be some fraud over here or some problematic activity, you probably don't want to embolden that algorithm to make changes to your business process on its own, right? You probably want to create some space for some human judgment to say, hey, wait, what's going on in this data? Let's analyze, let's talk to people, let's get to the bottom of what this data seems to be suggesting to us. So human in the loop, again, interrupts that action cycle and says, okay, we're going to empower people to make those choices. Same with something like regulatory surveillance, another idea that Commissioner Johnson teed up, this idea that regulators themselves might use analytical tools to help them identify where to focus their efforts. Absolutely. And here again, the contrast between human in the loop and out of the loop makes perfect sense. You probably also don't want a regulator saying, whatever the algorithm finds, I'm sure it's fine. Go ahead and assess those civil monetary penalties. I think a lot of people would say, hey, wait, we need a human in that loop, right? Okay, so here again, we get this dichotomy between in and out of the loop. We'll hear today, most likely, about using AI and different kinds of algorithms and analytical techniques to help locate regulations that might need another look, right? So either the regulators themselves or members of the public using different analytical tools to find some regulations that might be pain points, right? Might not be serving the purpose they were intended to serve, or might just not be worth it, right? So those tools, again, we wouldn't expect a human out of the loop scenario with something like that, right? You wouldn't expect a regulator to say, hey, if you find a problem, if you, the algorithm, find a problematic bit of our regulatory code, just feel free to chuck it to the curb, right? We're probably going to insist for a lot of reasons, not just, the law, which would definitely be a problem there. We're going to insist that a human's going to be involved. But again, it's this dichotomy between the extent to which the algorithm is empowered to act on its own, or it has to wait for a person. Now, all of that is about distancing the action, right? So sort of creating a break point between the algorithm and the people. In each case, the human in the loop already somewhat understates the nature of the human role here, because it's not just that you're looking on the assembly line to make sure that the toy coming off the line is the right shade of yellow, right? There is a more complex set of judgment that you need to deploy in order to figure out, should we keep this regulation or should we not, right? So human in the loop, to me, confers a level of simplistic thought, right? That the human point is just kind of a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, yes, no, right? But in the types of regulatory decisions that we've been talking about with these use cases, they're more complex than that. But there's something about that phrase, human in the loop, that makes it seem like you're just touching base with the person, right? Just give them 30 seconds for an up, down, yes, no. But a lot of the actual kinds of decisions that we're talking about are enormously complex. You would want to assemble a team. You would want to cross-check that data. You might even want to consult the public or stakeholders, right? There's a lot that goes into that and a lot that goes into regulatory decisions. So while I understand why people say it, I understand the genesis of the term, I just think it gets us in a mindset of underselling the human role in complex decision-making. And I think this is a bit of a risk, particularly when, as you'll also probably hear today, it's held up as sort of the all-purpose fail-safe. Well, don't worry, there's a human in the loop. Don't worry about these systems because it's okay. There's going to be a person who checks the work, right? We're simultaneously subordinating the role of the human to be just an editor, just a checker of somebody else's work, right? This bothers me. When it comes to certain kinds of decision-making, particularly in the regulatory context. And here's an example of why. So think about drafting regulatory changes. Regs do follow a format. I mean, if you've read a Federal Register notice, which actually, quick show of hands, who's read a Federal Register notice in this room? It's going to be an higher, above average. Okay. All right. My engineers, don't worry. You can do it anytime you want at a wonderful website called federalregister.gov. Everybody starts their day on federalregister.gov, right? So regulations follow a certain format. It is actually fairly formulaic. And so you could 1,000% train a model to mimic the regulatory style. There is a style. It's very learnable. A lot of regulatory professionals have spent their lives perfecting it, in fact, right? So it is teachable. It is learnable. It can be mimicked by generative AI. And my goodness, it sure takes a long time to write regulations. So if you could push a button and spit one out, holy smokes, that would save a lot of time, wouldn't it? So you can get wrapped up in a bit of an efficiency mindset, thinking, well, let's just write those dang words faster. Right? Because if we can write them faster, we can get those regulatory changes out into the world and won't everything simply be better, right? You can wrap yourself up in a rhetoric of efficiency on this. But if you know about the regulatory process, this is making you nervous, right? This is making you nervous because you know that agencies have a legal duty to engage in reasoned decision-making, to not make arbitrary and capricious decisions. So how do we square these two desires, right? Rapid text on the one hand, but that reason-giving duty on the other. So I have a paper called Ghostwriting the Government where I work through this question and just try to think about, okay, what is the agency's obligation? And to what extent might it also have an obligation to take advantage of technology that could allow it to do its work faster, either in a deregulatory or in a regulatory direction, right? I'm not espousing a view. I'm certainly not a regulatory maximalist. I'm certainly not a regulatory minimalist. I'm just saying, if you got to write the rules in one direction or another, what's the quickest way to get those things done in a way that complies with the law? These things are in tension. So my argument, and what I'm going to try to persuade you of in my remaining time, is that when it comes to reasoning, we can't outsource it. We just can't. It just doesn't work. And this is because of the deep connection between writing and thinking. And writing and thinking, I'm sure we have some writers in the room also, right? I know we do. For me, the writing is the thinking. I almost never know where I'm going to end up when I start writing something. Now, there are some unicorns out there. I think Brian Mannix might be one, actually, who thinks his thoughts and then can spool them onto the page in almost like a transmission belt, model. We don't have to worry about unicorns like this, okay? Most people, when they sit down to write, they're thinking as they go. Judges even have a word for this called does it right, right? So when a judge has an intuition about a case, they sit down to write an opinion, then they put themselves through the process of writing the opinion. And at the end of the opinion, if they say, you know what, this just isn't right, it doesn't write. The opinion doesn't write. This intuitive result that I thought was the way this case needed to go, it just isn't working. And they discover that in the process of the writing, right? So there's no shortcut to that, because if the judge just ruled from the bench and said, here's how I think the case turns out, they're going to miss that evolution of their thinking that writing gave them. This is just a very human element of how we write. It is different from editing. Editing is something different. You experience this in your life too. When you edit your own work or somebody else's work, sometimes you don't reorder the ideas. You don't necessarily challenge the framing every time, right? Maybe you go with the flow. Maybe the sentence level writing is beautiful. And you think, well, this is an elegant piece of writing. I can't bear to rip up the reasoning, right? But when your duty is to engage in reasoning, that is error, right? You have let yourself off the hook. You have shirked. So that's the argument of the paper, that basically writing is the way that we test ideas at a human level that replicates at an institutional level. There's no way to shortcut that process. And just saying to ourselves, well, I'm just going to let the Gen AI produce a first draft and then I'll edit it from there. That might work for a press release. That might work for certain kinds of filings, potentially. But when it comes to a task that demands reasoning, my argument is that this just doesn't cut it, right? And that this is a siren's call that will both degrade the quality of reasoning in the federal government and elsewhere, maybe even for judges, and that we need to be on guard. So back to today, as we get deeper into the day, we're going to hear about so many exciting possibilities. And I would just encourage you to consider that a human in the loop is not always the answer. It is not always enough. There are going to be some tasks where a human in the loop is really weak sauce for the nature of what's going on underneath. This idea of defaulting to an inside or outside the loop frame, I think is error. I understand why we got here, but I'm just asking you to interrupt that way of thinking and demand something more. I think it's a mistake because it subordinates the beautiful complexity of human judgment and thought. It violates the duties the law confers upon agencies to do their own thinking. And frankly, we just deserve better. So thank you.
See, we need our AI masters to help us with this.
Humans.
Well, see what happens when humans are in the loop. You don't switch the microphone.
It's good.
There we go. Okay, so the first question from an anonymous person, thank you, is, are there any inherently government functions that should not rely on generative AI?
Yes. I mean, first of all, shout out to somebody who knows about procurement law. That's a phrase from procurement law, the inherently governmental function. This is something in our contractual law in the government that says that the government cannot contract out, right, outsource, quote, inherently governmental functions. This comes from the idea of use of force in the military context, this idea that we shouldn't, that there are certain military functions that we should not simply contract out. Obviously, we've pushed the lines on that over the years, but that's sort of where it comes from. That's been brought over into the procurement space. And I would argue, absolutely. I think drafting documents within the government, certain kinds of decisional documents should absolutely not be outsourceable because of the potential for conflicts of interest and also the way it hollows out the agency's ability to produce those things on its own.
So I'm gonna freelance and ask one question here, Bridget. So any of us who've ever been involved in remote traffic enforcement, say you've gotten a remote speeding ticket or a remote stop sign ticket, it's almost certain that those are better than humans in terms of more accurate. How many of us would be happy with having no human involved in the assessment of a fine by the government?
That kind of fine? Yeah, I'm good with that.
You're good with that?
Yeah.
Okay. She did surprise me because I'm not.
What did you think I was going to say? What do you think?
I don't think you can have the government coercively sanctioning people without some human ability. Otherwise, you have outsourced to challenge it, right? Even though the machines are almost never wrong.
I mean, yeah, but to me, that's the thing is like, if it is a binary test, did you drive over this line at this speed? And do we have the receipts to show that that's what you did? Mm-hmm. I'm less bothered by it. I mean, it irks me. Of course, I would never violate a traffic law, but
none of us ever would. But if we somehow did,
right? But if I hypothetically did, it would be annoying. But I would also say, yeah, okay, I was speeding. Right?
Okay, so let me ask you: if AI reviewed your tax return and disallowed deductions and sent you a bill, would you be okay with that?
I don't really know what's involved in tax enforcement. I want to know what Joe Cordes thinks about that.
I think it would depend on the complexity.
Depend on the complexity, right? Like on the complexity of the return.
I think I'd be just fine with it, but the more
would the person filing the return be okay with it? That's the question.
I'm potentially unbothered by that as well.
I mean, some are already comfortable with the idea of basically sending in some data, like in California for the Ready Return program, and they'll calculate your liability, but they don't do it for even moderately complicated returns.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a chance that I could just have the government calculate what income tax I owe, and that I could audit that as needed, but it would just happen and I didn't have to file a return, I think I'd be pretty down with that, actually. Sounds pretty nice.
Okay. All right. So the next question. I help facilitate the rulemaking process. How can AI help agencies streamline and improve the drafting of rules?
Yeah, I think this is a question that a lot of agency folks are asking, and they're being asked from the outside too. So I guess I would just say be careful, because I don't doubt that there are things that generative AI and all kinds of analytic tools can assist with. But at the point where you're saying something like, draft up an options memo on this policy, I'm starting to get worried, right? I don't know what that model was trained on. I don't know who has access to this. I also think it's important for our agencies to maintain the capacity to think internally. And so I am less bothered, if you were to come up with a few regulatory approaches and then ask ChatGPT, what approaches other than X, Y, and Z might we consider? That's cool. Like, that's a nice prompting, right, to your own thinking, but just sort of handing over the drafting process and thinking, well, that's okay, I'll just check it all when I edit it. That is, to me, that is a siren's call. That is a mistake. That leaves you out of it in too fundamental a way.
Okay. Do agencies have a legal obligation to have a human read every public comment? Many government officials seem to believe this, and I know this is something that we've thought a lot about at the Regulatory Studies Center.
Yeah. So this is where we start to intersect with the sort of the appeal of tech and the efficiency of tech and the legal duties that an agency faces. And you'll find some agency counsel that still believe that a human needs to touch and read every comment. But I think that's probably at this point a minority view, not least because we have tools inside of regulations.gov, which is the place that public files its comments for the most part. There are analytical tools inside of that system that allow agencies to identify like duplicative material in comments. And from my understanding, it's pretty commonly used by agencies. And so that means if you get a letter writing campaign with 85,000 emails that are majority the same text, a person doesn't need to read every single one. And we should embrace that, I think, because it will slow the agency down without a lot of value to ask an agency to read 85,000 duplicative comments. However, you can take this too far, right? I mean, AI and large language modeling offers, topic modeling, for example. And if you were to say, okay, let's just see, let's just load all these comments into a database and have an LM give us what the top 5 topics are, and that's what we'll really focus on. I think that's probably handing too much analytical authority over to the algorithm. I think it can be a complement also to help make sure you didn't miss anything. But the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, requires agencies to consider comments that are received. And so there's a tension there. If you outsource too much of that, you've potentially lost something in the process. And I am a little bit worried about that. As far as I know, agencies have not been challenged for doing that, but we'll see.
Okay, one final one. I know we're almost out of time, and this is probably not going to be the shortest of questions, or shortest of answers. But what do you think of using AI to remove regulations?
So I want to know what people mean by that, right? Because I think that we can use all kinds of analytics to identify potential targets for regulations to reconsider, streamline, change, update, whatever your term of art is. When it comes to actually going through the regulatory process to alter a regulation, I do not think we can shortcut that. I mean, the law doesn't allow us to. The law requires an agency, again, to engage in reasoned decision-making, not engage in arbitrary decision-making. And the way that they do that is by showing their work and moving through the regulatory process. So I think the follow-up question to that is, what do you mean by that? And let's get into the specifics, because I can think of ways that these tools could assist regulators in that task. But the idea that you just load it all into an algorithm and then print whatever it wants in the Federal Register absolutely violates existing duties that agencies have, and they should continue to have.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Dooling, as a terrific speech as always, and a lot of really interesting questions today, and we look forward to the rest of the panels.